Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Christian, I'm the director here at the Centre for Social Justice. It's a real privilege to have you with us for a brilliantly attended Fringe meeting, and I think it's going to be one of the most interesting we do all week. Before we go on to this one, I should just plug the one we've got next, which is with the Home Secretary in this room about 6:30, talking about her work to tackle modern day slavery, which she spoke about just now in the main hall as part of her speech. So I can recommend that you just hang around outside for a while and come back in at 6:30. It should be a fascinating session. But the one we've got to look at now is all about child poverty and social mobility, and how you tackle both of those two challenges that we face as a country. And what we'll do is I will speak very briefly now, work through the two panelists on my left, and then hand over to Tim Montgomery to chair a session of questions and answers, and also to feed in any comments he might have. We've got a brilliant panel for this evening, though. As I say, Tim Montgomery, really delighted you're here, Tim. He was comment editor, of course, at the Times, founder of Conservative Home, and actually a co-founder at the Centre for Social Justice here. So it's good to have you back home, and thank you for your time. I know how busy you are during this week, so we appreciate your time. Stephen Bryan, who I've known for a number of years now at the Centre for Social Justice. Stephen led our work on welfare reform, chairing a piece of work with Breakthrough Britain, which then led to a report called Dynamic Benefits, which produced the idea of universal credit, in effect. So Stephen really is the brains behind what's taking place at universal credit and the principles there. And since that report, has been working for Ian Douglas-Smith at the Department for Work and Pensions as an expert advisor these last 2 years on welfare reform and universal credit. Before then, of course, was at Oliver Wyman. So Stephen has a brilliant contribution to make this afternoon. And Alan Milburn, who is an unfamiliar territory, I imagine, at Conservative Conference, but it's really good to have you here, Alan. I work with Alan. Alan chairs the Commission on Social Mobility and Child Poverty, which is an independent commission set up by a Deputy Prime Minister under the Coalition, and I'm privileged to be on that commission and working with you, Alan. But thanks for being with us and telling us about what you're doing as a Commissioner on that brief, and of course was Secretary of State for Health under Labour government previously, and I think has now genuine cross-party respect, really, as an individual for what you're doing on these issues and the way you are determined to hold whoever's in government to account on improving social mobility and reducing child poverty. So it's a real privilege to have you here as well. And thanks for coming to be with us. The last thing I'll say is, of course, although today's focus at the conference, and perhaps most of the general election campaign that's imminent, might be about the economy, I think it's really important that within that debate we don't try and divorce the economics from the social. We've tried to work as a think tank to demonstrate how social reform, social mobility, social justice really drive a healthy economy. Without those things, the economy suffers. And we were highlighting recently the fact that under the previous government, the economy, in a sense, experienced a period of real boom. Job creation was high, unemployment was though stubbornly high as well. In parts of the UK, worklessness soared. The benefits bill went up 60% in real terms during that period of rapid economic growth. So our line is really that economic growth does not necessarily bring down things like the benefit bill. It doesn't necessarily lead to more socially just society. And we can perhaps explore more of that this evening. But I will sit down and hand over to you, Alan. Thanks for being with us. And then we'll hand Stephen, and then Tim can take on questions and answers. But thanks for being with us. If you want to tweet, feel free. Our name at the CSJ is @CSJ Think Tank. Do tag us if you have the characters, although I know 140 is pretty tight. So, but over to you, Alan. Thanks very much.
Christian, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to my friends at the Centre for Social Justice for organising my very first visit to a Conservative Party conference. Depending on how it goes, I may come back, so that's all dependent upon you. I'm delighted that Christian in particular is here because he's doing a really good job of work on our commission, which is newly established. And I'm delighted that the Centre for Social Justice is doing the work that it is, because you're keeping a very, very important flame alive about not just the fact that we need to do something about these issues around fairness and social justice, but to find practical ways of doing so. You really led the pack as far as that is concerned. I've got a pretty personal reason for caring about these issues. I got very lucky in my life. I grew up on council estate in the northeast of England, and I was fortunate enough to end up in cabinet. I was born at the right time. I was born in 1958, so you can work out my age, which is the year that the academics say was the peak year of social mobility. It wasn't by any means a golden age, because there was the most appalling poverty and grueling inequality. But everything seemed possible. The prospect of a classless society actually seemed within reach. People wrote about it. People foretold it, prophesied it would happen. Wind on 5 decades, and that post-war optimism looks pretty hopelessly misplaced. Flatlining social mobility, entrenched inequality, have thwarted repeated attempts by governments of different persuasions to realise that post-war vision of a good and fair society. But I've always believed a simple thing, which is that every cloud really does have a silver lining. And if you like, as birth rather than worth has become more and more a key determinant of life chances over recent decades, parties from across the political spectrum have pinned their colours once again to the meritocratic mast. And that is a development that I regard as really welcome. I welcome too that the coalition has decided to maintain a commitment which it would be easy to have abolished, which is a commitment to abolish child poverty by 2020, a commitment that it had inherited from the government in which I served, and a commitment to make social mobility its overriding social policy objective. Now, by definition, making progress on these issues, as Christian and Stephen know fine well, is going to be a long-term task, and it is no easy one. Some people say that it's an impossible one. That to reduce poverty in these circumstances, with the issues that George Osborne was setting out to you today, and indeed to undo privilege and enhance mobility in our society, is an objective that is for the birds. And yet we know from other societies that we can reduce poverty and we can improve mobility, and we know from our history that that is possible too. Now, clearly, in these circumstances, we face 2 very strong headwinds. The first is a squeeze on family incomes, and the other is a squeeze on public spending. In this time of austerity, if we are to make progress on reducing poverty and improving mobility, then anyone who cares about this issue, whether parties of government or parties that aspire to government, have to be very clear about one thing, which is, what is it that will give the biggest social mobility bang for the buck? What are the choices and the priorities that can be made that will ensure that the prospects of poverty being lower and mobility being higher can actually be realised? Now, the truth is, there is no single lever that can give you more social mobility or indeed lower poverty. It's as much about what parents do as what schools do, as career services, as university admissions procedures, as the role of employers or local councils. The Prime Minister was right when he said, I hope he still says it, we are all in this together. It requires national effort, in which government, of course, can play a lead. There's no single lever that you can pull. But the most important thing, I believe, is this. It's about education and employability. Why? Because the reason that Britain became a more socially mobile society in the 1950s and the early 60s was because of a profound change in the labour market. The move, if you like, from a manufacturing to a services-based economy, which gave millions of women and men the opportunity not to go into blue-collar employment, but to go into white-collar employment, to move up, to become professionals. Since the 1970s, we faced another big change in the labour market. The advent of what people call a knowledge-based economy, where the premium is ever more on education, skills and qualification. Now, the truth is we have a 2-tier labour market and have had for very many decades in our country. If you get a skill or a qualification, by and large, you stand a chance of getting a decent job, good pay, and the prospect of social advance. Those without those attributes, without a qualification or a decent education, tend to face a twilight zone of endemic low pay, constant insecurity, and if we're frank, little prospect of social progress. Now, in my view, healing the social divisions that exist in Britain requires us to do something about that two-tier labour market. I've got 4 suggestions about what might be done. These are exactly the same suggestions, incidentally, that I've made, I must be cursed in my life, to the Liberal Party conference as well as the Labour Party conference. And I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. 4 big levers that seem internationally, from the global evidence base that we can see, to give us the best prospect of less poverty and more mobility. 1, a focus on the early years. The OECD say that the countries that have the lowest poverty and the highest mobility are those that are correlated with high quality, universal, affordable childcare. Britain spends 0.5% of our GDP on childcare. Denmark and Sweden spend 1%, double. Why is it important? It's important for 2 big reasons. 1, because the early years are the point at which a child's development takes place. And importantly, it's the point at which the gap between poor kids and wealthier kids begins to open up. And good quality childcare in early years make a profound difference to closing that gap. The second reason it's important is this, is that it raises the maternal employment rate. Britain tops the global league table for this. We have the highest proportion of women saying they work part-time and would like to work full-time because of their caring responsibilities. 42%. And that's why it is good that the last government introduced more free childcare for 3 and 4-year-olds, and this government has extended it to 2-year-olds. What I don't see, however, is this. 2 big things on childcare in early years. 1, I don't see a long-term plan for improvement. I see short-term incremental improvements, which George announces in every budget, but I don't see what the long-term plan looks like. And if there isn't a long-term plan in government, by and large, my friends, it doesn't happen. And the second thing that I don't see is as much emphasis placed on supporting parents to do their job as supporting childcare institutions to do theirs. For the last 20 or 30 years, public policy, whether of right or of left, has focused on institutional childcare, important of course, but hasn't focused on the critical role that individual parents play in their children's future prospects. The biggest influence on a kid, it's not the school, it's not the Sure Start, it certainly ain't the local authority, it's the parent. And this is really difficult territory for politicians. Every politician is afraid of the nanny state headline, interfering in family life, telling parents what to do. And yet we know that some parents perform differently from others when it comes to reading their kids. Some parents read to their kids and some don't. Government has a role in supporting parents to be better parents. Second thing that we need to do, in my view, is we need to give as much attention to closing the education attainment gap, the gap in performance between rich kids and less rich kids, as we give to raising standards in schools. Governments, this one and the last one, focused absolutely on raising the bar, improving standards in schools. Michael Gove, I would say, is obsessed about it, and it's a good thing that you have a Secretary of State for Education who is obsessed about better standards in schools. I want to see Michael as obsessed, as well as raising the bar, closing the gap. And it can be done. Kids in London schools today who are on free school meals, and those kids are the poorest sixth of our society. At GCSE, 5 GCSEs perform 50% better than children in other parts of the country. That didn't happen by accident, it happened by design. It happened because actually the government that I was in was concerned about performance in the inner city school in London. And we introduced something called London Challenge, and it made a difference. So it can be done. But the truth is, the gulf between kids on free school meals and kids who are not is still massive. I think every school in this country knows that the Secretary of State for Education is concerned about their standards, raising the bar, I'd like to see every school as concerned about the attainment gap, closing the gap. Second thing that we need to do. Third thing that we need to do, the societies that are most equal and most successful and most mobile are those that ensure that there is free and fair access both to higher education opportunities and, critically, to vocational training opportunities. In the UK, we have two problems. When in higher education, you have 4 private schools and 1 college that every year send more students to Oxbridge than 2,000 state schools put together, that is what we call a problem. And universities need to do far more about it. Where government needs to focus, in my view, is where government hasn't focused for 30 or 40 or 50 years. I can tell you, I've lost count of the endless meetings I've been in about the future of higher education policy, about universities. I've barely been to a single meeting about the future of further education or vocational training. If you think about it, further education students get far less investment per head than university students. They face far more variability and quality of the colleges that they attend than universities. And think of this. When my kid goes to university, he has one thing he has to do. He fills in a UCAS form, single form. And then you're in the system. If you're going on the vocational training route, 40 funding streams, 30 different sorts of providers, no single access point for a cohort of kids that probably is of lower ability than those who are going to the higher education route. So what have we got to do? We've got to do 2 or 3 things. One, we've got to make sure that career services, the forgotten part of the education system, are put back in. Michael Gove has done one good thing. He's devolved responsibility for careers to schools. That's a good responsibility. It's where they belong. Sadly, he hasn't devolved the resources to go alongside the responsibilities. And in my view, that is what he needs to do. Second, we've got to start paying further education colleges like we pay other bits of our public services. I introduced this in the National Health Service. We should pay them not according for what they do, but what they achieve. The outcomes that they actually achieve for the students who attend. So I'd like to see a payment by results system introduced into further education. And the third thing that we have to do there is we've got to simplify the so-called pathway, which allows a kid who's going to further education to have as easy an access route as those going to a university education. The final thing that I'll be brief about, because Stephen will talk about it, I'm sure, at length, is we've got to make sure that work always pays. That incentives for employment are always there. In public policy, we used to think, for the last 20 or 30 years, that work was the best way out of poverty. And it sort of is a necessary condition to get out of poverty. But what we know today is that it's not a cure for it. Why? Because 60% of kids who are in our country today who are officially poor, according to the government's own statistics, are in a family where someone is in work. There are 5 million people today, my friend, who earn less than the living wage, most of them women. And these are the people who are politicians, whether it's David Cameron or Ed Miliband or Nick Clegg, these are the people who do the right thing. They're the people who listen to what politicians like me used to say. Stand on your own 2 feet, don't rely on the state, go out to work hard. They are the forgotten people of Britain. 5 million people. Okay? And they should be the focus for our efforts. Why? Because they are the families that have kids who are in poverty. This is not a recent problem, it's a long-running problem. Since 2003, if you've been in the lower half of the income distribution, your real-time earnings have not risen. Meanwhile, of course, prices have. Gas prices. have trebled since 2001. Food prices have increased by a third since 2007. What used to bridge, as Stephen knows, the gulf between earnings and prices was the taxpayer. The state, through tax credits, which hit £30 billion in the last year of the Labour government. In an age of austerity, it is no longer possible for the taxpayer to purely shoulder that burden. We're going to have to ask a difficult thing. We're going to have to ask employers to step up to the plate, alongside taxpayers. More of them paying the living wage, and by that, incidentally, I mean local councils as well as FTSE quoted companies. More muscular transparency so that the public can see who is paying the living wage and who is not, what the pay ratios are between the top and the bottom. And in my view, we should give a new remit to the Low Pay Commission so that it can recommend differential pay rates for some sectors of the economy that could perfectly well afford to pay more, as distinct from those who may not. So these are 4 steps that we could take. A good step that is being taken, in principle at least, is universal credit. We will see how it turns out in practice, but in principle, incentivizing people to do the right thing is the right thing to do. So, just to finish on one point, all of these are actually easy things to do. Deciding what to do is dead easy. Okay? Read the international evidence, learn from history. The really hard thing is knowing how to do it. I have one small suggestion for this conference, which is if the Conservative Party today, as I hope this is the best attended fringe meeting I've been to, incidentally, across all the 3 party conferences. So I'd say something about you, or I'd say something about me, I don't know, probably not. I'm on a journey. Yes. You never know. Time for a U-turn. A small suggestion. If the Conservative Party is really bothered about these issues of social mobility and child poverty, then ensure that every decision that is taken, particularly at budgets, which are the critical decision-making points, is put through the prism of a social mobility perspective. So what I would like to see, George conceding that the Office for Budget Responsibility should be given a new responsibility, which is to sense check, acid test, assure that a budget is fully assessed for its social mobility and child poverty impact. And I would like that study to be published at the very moment where George Osborne stands at the dispatch box in the House of Commons to deliver his budgets. I think that will help George. I think it will definitely help the country. And I think it will help us deliver what parties from across the political spectrum now say that they intend to deliver, which is a society with far less poverty and far more mobility. Hurrah to that consensus having developed. Let us test whether the actions match the intentions. That is the job that Christian and I have on the Commission for Social Mobility and Child Poverty. Thank you for listening.
Terrific, Alan. Thank you so much. Huge amount of food for thought there. And Paul Cleary, another one of the commissioners, is with us this evening as well. There is some more room to the side here if anyone would like to take it. Oh, there's some more room up here. People.
Is there a space in that seat as well? Is everybody moved along the road? That might help. Any spare spaces?
We could probably move back. There's lots of room up here. Well, that's not lots. Just your feet.
You worry about what you said, so.
Excellent. There's plenty. Yeah, Lucy. As people come in, there's more room just up here.
Table here, someone can sit in.
Yes, we can move the pop up. So you're not here. Without much more delay, I'd love to hand over to Stephen Bryan now. Stephen, it's good to have you with us, and I know you'll have your own points to make and anything in response. And then after Stephen, Tim's in charge and takes some questions.
Well, thank you, Christian, and Alan for that last set of comments. I think I feel as if I'm in that sort of position where I'm with somebody who's campaigning in poetry, and now I'm going to have to talk about governing in prose. I think it's hard to disagree with what, Alan, you've said. But I think, as you also know, and as you mentioned in your last few remarks, actually doing it in government practically is much more difficult than setting out what I think is a very admirable agenda, and one that I would wholeheartedly agree with the aspirations of. And I think even just if I come back to your comments at the very end, because I think it ties into some of the issues that I would like to talk about. Your comments about George Osborne in his budget setting out the agenda and articulating its impacts on social mobility and poverty. If that's going to work, we have to be really clear and really tight in our understanding of what we mean by those terms, and avoid risks that we have seen previous governments do of, in effect, gaming those definitions. So I think we're all familiar with the poverty definition, 60% of the median income. We've also seen, when we look at historic movements of that there was a lot of gaming around that 60% line and moving people through income transfers from one point to another and declaring a reduction in poverty. Or indeed, even worse, in the years following the Great Recession, 2009, 2010, because the median income line fell because of, exactly as you said, Alan, reducing wages, poverty miraculously disappeared. And yet nobody would argue that poverty really disappeared.
Sure.
So I think when we look at this, we run a risk of, I think, looking at poverty in a way that has been too narrowly defined, which has been typically an income measure. And I think on the other side, social mobility has actually not been clearly enough defined.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we can all agree with what you're saying, Alan, but when push comes to shove, we're going to have to make some tough choices about what social mobility we're willing to invest in, what social mobility we don't have the resources to invest in. Let's start with poverty. I think what we want to be thinking about here is about a situation where people don't have enough resources of their own to be able to meaningfully navigate life. And I think there's two parts to this. One is what do we mean by resources? And the other bit I'd like to introduce is that sense of their own. So I think one can say simply looking at money is not the right thing to do. We need to think about people's capacities, social networks, indeed even budgeting skills to be able to actually make the most of what money they have. But I'd like to take that a stage further and say, even though I know that you and your commission have responded to the government's consultation favourably in this area, push it to the next stage and say that what we've always been focusing on in the public debate has actually been a measure of how well has the government of the day alleviated underlying poverty through income transfers. And we spend our time looking at how good the alleviation has been. We don't spend our time measuring and talking about the underlying poverty. So I think what we need to do if we want to move this debate on is actually spend more time about the underlying poverty and then indeed measure and judge the government's ability to alleviate it. But actually there are two problems to solve. One is reduce the underlying level. Secondly, where it's impossible or we've yet to reduce the underlying level of poverty, provide an appropriate form of alleviation. And I think the government needs to be judged on both of those at the same time, not just the historic judgment of alleviation. I think when it comes to social mobility, we need to think about something a little bit tighter and more narrowly defined. And I would see this as an issue around social stasis, or what's the problem we're trying to deal with here? Because social mobility is a nice, very attractive phrase, but what does it really mean? What's the issue we're trying to get at? And I think it really has to come down to a fairly narrow issue around particularly the life chances of people who grew up in families where there's underlying poverty. I think we have to start looking at saying we're really most worried about those who are growing up in workless households, in very low income households, and saying what's happening to them as adults? What is their trajectory? And what are we actually looking for here? Because I think we've also got this trade-off, and Alan, I think, rightly said it with respect to the ambition around vocational training, that the most important thing is to give that group as a whole a trajectory that maximises their chance of good, secure, well-paid employment. I think, as he said, taking it to the next level of increasing the number of Oxford is certainly an aspiration, something we mustn't ignore, but I think we can't regard that as the primary thing we're trying to achieve, because we'll end up focusing on providing luck to a very small number, as opposed to saying, who are the large group of people who today are missing out, and how do we incrementally help them, as opposed to merely just taking a few and pushing them through the system and giving ourselves a big pat on the back. We've got to think about the help for the large group of people. And the way we're going to do that, I think, is look at the underlying causes. So if we go back to CSJ's work, Breakthrough Britain, Breakdown Britain, really starting to articulate the 5 pathways to poverty. As Alan says, worklessness in this case has to be the biggest and most important one of those pathways. Because if you don't have money of your own, irrespective of how much money the state is giving you, if you don't have money of your own resources, you are going to be disempowered. And all the studies show that it's not the income of the household that affects the child's life choices. It's the earned income is the most important driver of the child's life choices. So worklessness, biggest underlying factor. Another one that we have to look out for is areas of addictions, which Christian and his predecessors have worked on, because what they do to the money that you may or may not have. They divert your efforts, they divert your resources into spending on drugs or alcohol or not pursuing a constructive life. Debt, because of the way it traps you. And then the other 2 original causes, family breakdown and educational failure, Alan has touched on it, because of the fact they create the longer term challenges. I'd add to that housing and homelessness, which indeed the CSJ picked up on very shortly after Breakthrough Britain as one of the areas to look at. I think when we look at pathways to social status or lack of social mobility, I would add an area to Alan's list, which I thought were absolutely right. And that is around some of the cultural and social aspects. So it's not just, is there discrimination in the education system, and you can absolutely rightly point a finger at universities for not doing enough outreach. But actually, what about the social aspiration, the grit, the determination, the social environment that everybody's growing up in? I read a brilliant book recently by an economic historian called Deirdre McCluskey, called Bourgeois Dignity and Bourgeois Virtue. I don't know if you've come across it. Her argument is very interesting, that the Industrial Revolution was triggered in this country because of attitudes and cultures that she described as bourgeois. I don't need to worry about the term, but the issue was that following the Glorious Revolution, the Dutch coming across, attitudes about commerce, trading, the value of a merchant versus the value of a landowner changed in this country. And that triggered people's willingness to trade, people's curiosity about an invention down the road, as opposed to how big somebody's castle was down the road. And it started to create a culture that valued commerce, that valued enterprise. And I think this is something that we need to think about. How are we creating the next industrial revolution that will actually drive social mobility? It's not just simply about growth, but there's a revolutionary aspect that we have to engender here to create the equivalent of where we were in the 1950s, that there is change, things are happening, things are going to be different. And I think a cultural and social aspect of that's going to be very important. Now, if we take that as sort of a tableau of what we're looking at, I think then from a point of view of government, we have to be really clear about the outcomes that we want to prioritise. I go back to saying we want to reduce the underlying poverty level as the first and most important thing, because that is the here and now. Do that through addressing the pathways to poverty. They're sustained by having more people in work, fewer people addicted, lower levels of consumer debt, particularly when they're low paid. I think then we say we need to alleviate that poverty in a more effective way. Now, why are we worried about a 60% of median income when there are many people whose poverty level is at 40% because they're unable to take up benefits, they don't know about them, we don't help them, etc. So you're saying worry about that number is not the right thing. We've got to make sure that our alleviation, when we ask the question in terms of alleviation, we see it through a different prism, which says we've got a group of people who are in underlying poverty, a group we're not helping but deserve our help. And we need to look again at where those resources are going, having put some or more of our energy into reducing poverty in the first place. And I'll come back to in a minute what I think we've been doing in that area. And then saying, as I mentioned, social mobility, starting to say, okay, what are the levers? And I think this is where perhaps the CSJ and Christian, you could actually help with just sort of more of a Breakthrough Britain style report on the real underlying drivers of social mobility. But my feeling is that the consensus on poverty has not yet been replicated on the drivers of social mobility. We've all waved our hands, we've got ideas, we've got reports, etc. But there isn't the tone, the corpus of accepted knowledge about the real drivers so that we can focus our attention and in effect agree on an agenda such as the one Alan's put together, but agree on the basis of common understanding of the problems. Now, government is going to be doing two things. First of all, the consultation on poverty will start to give us, and when that comes out, the new poverty measurement will start to give us a richer conversation around the drivers. I would argue it needs to continue to focus on the underlying drivers. But then in addition to that, we have been engaging quite a wide range of welfare reform, and let me show how they come together into what I think will be the start of a change. But I would also agree with Alan that we should not be resting on these laurels, but let me at least give you a few of those laurels. Raising tax allowances has started to address the fundamental issue of, as Alan described, the hard-working poor who today, and up to recently, have been paying quite a bit of tax, and that's one reason why their own resources have not been sufficient. So it's been critical and important to raise the tax allowances. Next level, more controversial, but I think when you start to worry about underlying poverty, much more reasonable, has been the ESA reforms and the reduction of the age at which a lone parent's youngest child triggers them to be moving into JSA. Why is that important? Because what that has actually done below the radar screens has shifted tens if not hundreds of thousands of people over the last year or two out of worklessness into unemployment and then into work. Because if you look at the numbers, we have had relatively slow but systematic reductions in unemployment. At the same time that has been happening, the roles of the unemployed have been added to systematically by ESA reassessment and the change of the age of lone parents. So actually the amount of unemployment that this government has reduced has been very, very significant, because actually this reclassification has made the challenge even bigger. So I think, and I'm hopeful that as we see the ESA reassessment slow down once it's concluded, and when we've reached, I think a more ambitious age for people to be going out to work as lone parents, supported by childcare, I think we're going to start to see something quite different in the shape of the unemployment. So I'm very hopeful there. Now, Alan has been joking through his speech and beforehand about universal credit and the challenges involved in that. But let me at least lay out what that's going to do for us. It will further improve the incomes of low earners by tapering the entirety of their benefits more slowly than today. It will introduce further levels of childcare, particularly for those working fewer than 16 hours. And it will also start to produce further efforts around budgeting. So we will be supporting, both through different budgeting forms of advanced payments and loans, but also budgeting support, we will be starting to help people spend their money more wisely and take on more personal responsibility. I think one of the things that we sort of forget about is actually being poor is very costly. And one of the things we also have to do while addressing the income side of the ledger is also the expenditure side of the ledger. How do we actually reduce the cost of being poor is an area that we haven't spent enough time and energy on and could really make a big difference. The other side, on the education side, we've talked about the importance of that. I would agree that we have to move from just looking at overall attainment to closing the gap. The pupil premium is obviously a step in that direction. I think we could do more. I think we could ask more of the pupil premium, but that's in time to come. And I think also, with respect to family breakdown, the universal credit structure will reduce the couple penalty, and indeed this week we've heard about plans for tax breaks as well. While they are probably more symbolic than truly going to have an impact on incentive, I think we'll see at the universal credit side something slightly different, insofar as it will help low-earning couples in the fact that one earner will have a far better chance of being able to change the income of the household versus today's system, where in effect if you're a low earner, you have to get both into work to create some value. So I think those changes, when we bring them together, will start to move the needle, both in terms of poverty, particularly because this hidden effect of the unemployment numbers today. We're increasing labour force participation, and that will have a big effect. And I think slowly catch a monkey on social mobility, but there's a lot more I think to be done there. And relatively speaking, I would say that, I would agree, that's where we have to start to shift our attention. And I think for the future though, let's keep focusing on the underlying causes, because the two areas have the same set of underlying problems affecting them. And if we can focus on the underlying causes, we will then, I think, be in a better place. And I think this is where we come back to your George Osborne question. I think the real risk we have in the idea, which I think is right, is that if we focus too much on the set of statistics we have to report against, we'll end up for political means, addressing the symptoms rather than the causes. So I think good idea, but we need a bit more work, I think, before we jump on it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've had two absolutely fascinating talks. I've been taking so many notes down here. I could spend the next hour asking questions for follow-up, but I'm going to ask each of our speakers just one each before I throw it open to the room. And Alan, if I may ask you first to respond to Stephen's point about this measure. Is there a danger that something that focuses purely on financial measures will miss these underlying causes? What kind of test might you envisage? Perhaps some sort of family impact statement? Could that be a subset? You were very interesting. You talked about the importance of parents, and then perhaps afterwards, Stephen, I've become quite obsessed with the housing issue, which you briefly mentioned. And my own view is, in terms of a family policy, if we don't have more homes where people, with the problems of debt, insecurity, cramped conditions, people moving, if you want to design something to destroy family life, you'd have our housing crisis. So I'd maybe just briefly talk about housing and after Alan's remarks.
So I think it's a good question. So we, as Stephen knows, because you probably wrote it, did you, the consultation thing? So,
I didn't actually, but yes.
So the government the government consulted on a new child poverty measurement. We considered it in commission, Paul's here as well, and we basically sort of agreed with the fundamental premise, which is that income has to remain the. When we're talking about poverty in the end, we're talking about national defence. Right? It has to remain the foundation, but purely focusing on income. This is a whole raft of other factors that Stephen has thought about. Our submission to government basically said this, like, we know there is a good evidence base that tells you what sort of people are at risk from poverty. Whether it's a particular family structure or worklessness or some of the chronic problems of chaotic families that you've been very, very focused on, and rightly so. And so wouldn't it make sense to do this? For the government to have two baskets, and this becomes more complicated, but to have two baskets of measures. One, the number who are defined as being at risk from poverty, and then the number who are actually in poverty. And the job of government should be about minimising the transfer of the number being at risk to the number actually in poverty. Okay, so that's basically what we had to say about it. Now, by and large, received a reasonably sympathetic response within government, and I think government is about to come back, in fact, before too long, and sort of pronounce on the new child poverty measurement. Once that is done, we really need to focus on the job in hand, because we can spend a huge amount of time, and this is where I slightly disagree with Stephen. The thing I'm really worried about in the social mobility space, as distinct from the child poverty space, is the raft of indicators and targets and strategies we already have. I mean, honestly, if anybody bothers to look at them and count the number, I know targets are out of fashion in Whitehall, but you wouldn't think so. I mean, you really wouldn't. The number of indicators that we already have, and the danger in government, and the thing that I suppose I learnt more than anything else, is to get anything done, you need two essential ingredients. You need total clarity and total consistency. Because without that, it's hard enough to make change. Change is always a bloody hard thing to do, regardless, whether you're in the health portfolio, whether you're in the welfare portfolio. Without clarity, without consistency, you achieve nothing. And so, let's go through it. Let's have all the sort of arguments about the right indicator set. And then once we've alighted on it, then what we need to do is consistently and clearly apply policy instruments and levers in a way over time that affects change. And the truth about it is that you can do it. You can, London School has proved that you can do it in a relatively short period of time.
Okay. I'd love to say something about housing, but Stephen probably.
Sure, okay. Well, first one, may I say, I actually agree with you there are too many indicators, but I think narrowing them will require us to make some difficult choices, but that's what we have to do. So I'm on the same page there. On the housing, I absolutely agree that it is a big issue we have to address. I think there are a number of things that are playing in this space. One is the housing stock we have, particularly around social housing, is actually a mismatch versus the type of stock that we need. So we actually, there are too many larger houses, not enough smaller ones. we've got, I think, well-known debate around planning, which I think we're going to have to work our way through, because at the end of the day, subsidising people whether to buy more house or subsidising through housing benefit is throwing good money after bad if we're not addressing the fundamental issue, which is price. The underlying cost of housing is too great because the demand of housing is constrained, and to an extent the historic supply has had a bit of a mismatch versus what the demand is. I think the other part that we are not looking at and recognising is that between the social rented sector and the private rented sector, there's such a mismatch in the real and perceived quality of tenancies and tenures that we are creating artificial shortages in the social rented sector. We have, I think, crazy situation with people who have no income and are in the private rented sector and are being paid the housing benefit that fully covers their rent, are yet desperate to get into the social rented sector. We've got to ask ourselves what's going on where they would also have all their rent paid for. So there's no change in their financial situation, and yet we have massive queues of people on waiting lists for people to make that shift from one sector to another. That's clearly an indication there's something wrong in one or other, or probably both of those two sectors, in a way we're offering tenure to individuals and to have families. So I think there's a few real issues around the supply of the physical bricks and mortar and the supply of tenure that we need to work on to reduce the cost for both sides.
Okay, can I just make one point
Briefly,
on housing? Just so I think, look, the fundamental problem is there's a whole of problems, but the fundamental problem is a mismatch between supply and demand. Why have you got house prices cantering away in London? The truth is because there's an unbalanced economy. Okay. And the challenge now for this government will be, of course, to ensure that policies pursue growth, but also to ensure that the policies result in balanced growth. Otherwise, we will end up replicating exactly some of the problems that the previous government found. The issue around social mobility in housing, I think, is very, very straightforward. This is where, again, I slightly disagree with Stephen. So I think there's something about lifting people off the bottom and getting them on the first rungs of the ladder. And then there is something which is for a broader cohort in the population. Because I think what is happening is that for the first time in probably 100 years, parents are feeling and fearing that their children are going to be worse off than they are. They're going to feel that. I mean, they are feeling it. Doesn't matter about the rights and wrongs of the policy. Tuition fees, price of housing, average age to get on the housing ladder now as a first-time buyer in London is 39. 39. Kids leaving university and boomeranging back into people's homes. And that is an issue that cuts across low-income and middle-income Britain. And this is more a political point than a policy point. Parties that win are parties, whether it's Thatcher or Blair, that appeal equally to low-income Britain and to middle-income Britain, and recognise that the ingredient that they have to offer up is the ability to progress people's aspirations. And without that, you don't form an government. That's why the housing issue is so critically important and inextricably linked to this issue of social mobility.
Well, I so agree with what you've just said, and anybody in here, lots of conservatives in this room, this is a crisis for capitalism, because capitalism has always had inequality, but what is potentially different about the situation I think we're in now is people will accept inequality if they think there's a reasonable chance that their children can make it to the top. But actually, if you have an unequal system that is frozen in some way, then that's very dangerous. And I feel we're facing that, not just in Britain. I think it would be. I think our speakers would agree. A lot of the problems we've been talking about today are global phenomena. We're seeing lots of Western economies where people were going backwards or their incomes were stagnant long before the recession struck. So these are deep-seated global problems, part to do with technology, I think, partly to do with the rise of the East, and partly to do with family breakdown. And I was very encouraged to hear a man of the left, if I can describe who is that.
I've been described as that, but I'll take it. That's fine.
Talking about family breakdown. Right, we really are short of time, and I'm sure there's loads of questions. Can I take 3? And can I encourage our speakers, to be brief, and not necessarily answer all the questions, just if we get every person's question answered, but not necessarily by both of you. So the lady there, the lady there and the lady there. God, lots of ladies. That's unusual in some Tory meetings. Right.
Hello, Amy Gray from Hackney North, where I'm both a school governor and an ex-teacher. We've seen an increasing number of children who arrive at school not knowing any of their letters, not able to count, not being toilet trained, not being able to eat at the table with a knife and fork. There's clearly either too many parents who don't know how to parent or who are expecting the state to fill that gap. You said it's a very tricky issue for politicians, but I wonder if I could push you a little bit, perhaps to offer a couple of solutions.
Okay, the problems with parenting.
Hi, Maggie Pearson, Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of Salford, where we have 55% of undergraduates coming with BTECs and 45% widening participation. It's one of the reasons I went there to work. One of the problems, though, is I think we're not assessed on added value in the higher education sector, and I think it's a big gap actually, because people can say, well, at Salford you've got low entry requirements, whatever, but we make a real difference to people's lives. And we have a Salford Advantage programme which gives the employability skills that those students wouldn't be able to go on an unpaid internship for.
Okay.
But added value, I think, is a key, should be a key measure.
Thank you.
My question follows on from the previous one, which is how do we support parents to be better parents, all of us to be better parents, without it being stigmatising, and working on the assumption that being poor financially means being a poor parent?
Yeah.
I'll just say something. The Times did a poll with YouGov last week of 18 to 24-year-olds, and it was very interesting. Your point, Alan, about politicians' reluctance to use the term nanny state. And we said to people, we asked people a question, and we said, do you want the state to leave you alone in how you eat, whether you use drugs, etc., or do you think the state has a role to encourage people to be responsible? And I was expecting the overwhelming young just choose the first option. They didn't. It was about 35, 65. So I wonder whether there's more openness from the public to politicians saying there is a role for government.
Well, I think people know there's a problem. I mean, so that's a. I mean, it's to the how do you do it question. That's the $64,000 question. Now the truth is there isn't much of an evidence base. So you look across the world and there really isn't. There's some interesting stuff from the States that has been in part imported here, and it ranges from the really soft to the really hard. So in schools in Harlem, for example, in the old days they probably don't do it anymore. Effectively, the state and the school acted as the parent and effectively took the kids, not really took them, but sort of had them in the school for so many hours of the day that their interaction with the child was as long as the interaction of the parent with the child. So that's at one end of the spectrum. Family nurse partnerships, which this government has picked up, and the role of health visitors is really important. That's at the slightly softer end of the spectrum. And I think the missing piece in this is to try to better understand what sort of messages to parents play with particular audiences. Okay? So we know, for example, that better off parents tend to, not always, to your point, tend to read more to their kids because they have more books and so on and so forth in the home. And what that means is that by the age of 3 or 4, a child from a really poor background will have heard literally millions of fewer words than a child from a wealthier background. Now, so, but a lot of these parents are sort of using social media, they're very familiar, this generation, not mine, with the internet and so on and so forth. And so I think one thing the government needs to do is to get inside the heads of their parents and of those parents and better understand the sort of mediums and the sort of messages through which supported parenting might actually be meant to work. Okay? So I've got a suite of policies I can give you for a lot of things, but to be honest, I don't have a suite of policies for this, and we're going to have to invent them, and that's really hard, and it will be risky, notwithstanding what the public might think, because the public might think that, but with respect to any Daily Mail journalist in the room, I know that the Daily Mail won't. So, and that is something that, unfortunately people have to bear.
You want to come straight
Just to come in exactly on that, sorry, I'm not working at the moment. I was a Treasury economist previously, and now I have very small children, so I'm at home with small children dealing with some of these issues. And I was absolutely stunned when I had my second child, and the health visitor came just after he was born, and she said to me, I can tell when I walk into a house what that child's life chances are immediately. Not by the wealth of the family or what kind of house it is, but by the number of children's books there are if they have older siblings. because you are clearly going to sit down and read with your child and read and read and read. And I think what really worries me, I'm really sorry, I did miss your speech at the beginning, so maybe you covered this, but what really worries me is when I hear that a lot of this stuff is about tax breaks and encouraging people back to work. I worked at the Treasury when you were there.
Really?
But-
I'm sorry.
But, but now I think actually you've got a lot of young women, very young women in some cases, single mothers, at home with screaming kids, up all night, in a poverty trap, and actually rather than trying to say let's give you a tax break and get you back to work and leave your child somewhere else, why not have a policy that says let's set up something that brings you in with your child and we'll show you fun, interesting, exciting ways to interact with your child, read with them, play with them.
It's called family learning.
Build the
It happens.
relationship with your child and your parent,
Yes.
rather than saying, could you please go back to work and put them in some daycare where you don't see them, you don't build that relationship, and at the end of the day they come home, you're exhausted, and you're now going to stay up all night because they're crying.
So here's the here's the conundrum. So we ought to be honest about this. So my view, for what it's worth, is that I think women like men should be able to make informed choices in their lives. Okay. And if women choose not to go back to work, then that's not for them, and so on and so forth. The evidence suggests this. The evidence suggests that we have less poverty when you have in a family two members, two parents earning.
But
Both earning.
that's financial poverty.
Yes, I know, but it sort of matters.
Yeah, but there's a huge poverty.
We could discuss one issue, or we've only got a very short period of time, so I'm afraid, cut this short. Stephen, do you want to add anything? And then I just want to get a couple of questions.
Let me add on this as a sort of new parent to be in about 2 weeks' time. I've been reflecting on going to NCT classes and having another rich network of support around me with people who are look to me very capable, very open, very willing to help. Guys been out for beers together already, discussing the first birds. And I've been asking myself and my friends over the last week or two, where would I be? Where would we be without that? And what are the equivalents? And are we actually providing the networks? Are we helping at the very earliest stages? Why wasn't there an equivalent group of people from the estate down the road at that class? Why were we all nice middle class bankers, lawyers, accountants? Why weren't we genuinely mixing it up so that we could each be helping each other and learning from each other as we go along? So I think we've it's pre-birth we've got to start this at, and making sure that the social connections and support that we take for granted is being extended, and the richness we have to offer, we're genuinely offering to others.
Ryan, do you want to say anything about the question about added value?
Absolutely. And I fully agree with Alan when he said pay for performance. To start thinking, to get that mindset going and valuing results, I think is absolutely
I
right.
think so, and I think I think that's right for universities. I think it's right for schools. I also think it's right. I don't know what you think about this in terms of how we pay Job Centre Plus and private providers.
Yes.
So at the moment, we basically pay them for getting claimants off benefit and into work. Wouldn't it be interesting if we started incentivising them, not just for the number of jobs created, but for the wages and the earnings that the former claimant actually received?
Okay. So
Because otherwise what we do is we end up replicating the cycle of you get people off work, but they're still in low pay, and by the way, and this conference above all others should be concerned about this, I would guess, the taxpayer ends up picking up the bill for employers who are very often extremely wealthy and extremely profitable.
Okay, I'm going to take two more questions, and I'm afraid that will be all we have time for. So the gentleman at the back there,
That's good.
and there was another lady here. Yeah, the lady. Yeah. Sorry, I can't call anymore.
Is there a role for?
Should you say who you are? Sorry.
Graham Ells. Just a private.
That's it. That's
Um,
an important thing.
is
There's
there a
not so
role-
many of us as there were.
Is there a role for employers in this as well as universities? Because I've spent a long time in my previous life in the city, and I felt there was much more that could be done along city employers. I wonder if that's a part of this and should be given more emphasis by government. Because I know that you've been fighting for this, but I don't see much I may be wrong, but I haven't seen much emphasis in speeches and commitment and moral authority from the government.
Heather Acton, I'm a Westminster City Councillor, and we've had some pilot projects with Save the Children, where they go into nursery schools and primary schools, targeting preschool meal families and bringing in the families in to work with the school and the teachers, and that has been very successful. Michael Gove has been to see it. Would you support projects like that?
Perhaps would you go and visit it, Alan, as well, as part of your work on the commission?
Thanks. Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, I think that's right, and I think Stephen's point is absolutely right, that the earlier the start, the better the outcomes we get, and we sort of know that. I think it is, however, trying to establish, there's lots of really good stuff around. I mean, so let's not sort of despair that it's all hopeless. What I don't see, and this partially goes to Graham's point, I don't see economies of scale. Okay, either in the space that you're talking about or in what you're talking about. So to take employers, lots of employers are doing really interesting things. You know, outreach into schools, trying to pay the living wage, developing career progression routes that mean that you might start at the bottom but you stand a feasible chance of working your way up to the top. And what I don't see is scale. So a small example, the government has something called the Social Mobility Compact, which it asks employers to sign up to. You know, are you a social mobility friendly employer type of thing, really good idea, and so on and so forth. But there's nothing that, no conditionality around it. So virtually anyone can come to the party regardless of whether they're underage. You know, so what could employers do? There are some simple steps, and actually Paul and I are trying to codify this at the moment. There's some simple steps that we'd like employers to take. You know, do school outreach in a way that is consistent. Don't always go to the same old schools. Tower Hamlets, to take a borough not far from yours, is inundated with investment bankers, poor things. You know, because why? Because loads of city firms, the easiest place to go is Tower Hamlets. In my own constituency in Darlington, there was not an investment banker to be sat on, whether that was a blessing or a curse, but I mean, you know. So do school outreach in a structured way that genuinely reaches out to as many communities as possible. Yeah. Make sure that internships, the new rung on the career ladder in our country, that they're openly advertised, that they go on the basis not of what you know, not of who you know, but what you know. And preferably, if they're for more than a few weeks of work experience, pay them. Because otherwise, a middle-class family can afford to subsidise the kid and the working-class family can't. So guess what? We end up recycling and reinventing that spiral of advantage and disadvantage that everybody in this room is concerned about. So there are some really simple things that employers could be asked to do, but that requires the government to take a lead, wrap its arms around the issue, and persuade and cajole and encourage employers and their organisations, representative organisations, to really put their shoulder to the wheel.
And one area on that, speaking of that, one area where I think the government would like to see more engagement has been on the work experience opportunity we're providing to young people on JSA, where we have fantastic success rates of people who actually get that first rung of that and get some experience. We pay the JSA while they're doing it for a few weeks. We're running out of employers willing to engage with us, and that seems like a real shame because it's got such a success record.
We are a little over time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to finish there. I'd like to thank Stephen and Alan, and particularly can thank Christian and the Centre for Social Justice for putting this on. It's a fantastic fringe programme that the CSJ has put together. And Christian has done, and his team have done a fantastic job in keeping all of these issues that I'm sure matter to everyone in this room on the agenda. And so I really wish Christian and the CSJ every success in their work. What Stephen and Alan have shared with us today, we have made a lot of progress in the past. This is still a great country to live in, but those 5 million people that were mentioned to us who are struggling to make ends meet, they're caught between stagnant or falling incomes, rising prices with the rate of inflation affecting low-income people, often greater than the rate of inflation for average families, average income families. And then people without savings, vulnerable to loan sharks. Those three things, incomes, prices, no savings. And there's a lot of social challenge still in our country. I'm very glad the Coalition has set this commission up, and it's great that Christian is helping Alan with his work, and I think let's all end with a round of applause that is also an encouragement in their incredibly important work. And